If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. Brewers have a lot of different decisions to make when it comes to making their best beer. From recipe design to equipment to where and how to store ingredients, each of those decisions requires data. What types of data are important and how different types of data can be used together to answer these questions is also important. This is the topic that I discussed last week with Dr. Julia Jennings and Jeff Daly of John I. Haas, and this week I'm back in the lab with my co-host Jordan Folks to apply the science of that episode. Jordan, welcome back to the lab.
Thanks, Cade. Yeah, I think that data is a really important thing in our brewers' lives, and without it, we wouldn't ever make beer better. I think that the phrase goes something like, you can't improve what you haven't measured, right? And for me personally, I have been acquiring data my entire life as a brewer, and really, piece by piece, I think I'm able to make better beer by learning from the mistakes of the past and really listening to podcasts like this one.
No, for sure. Absolutely. Me as a brewer, as a brewing scientist in training, and you as a working social scientist and also brewer, we both love data. But as, not all data is created equal. And I guess rather I should say, not all data answers the questions that you're actually asking. So getting good data is really important. So for example, in last week's episode, Julie and Jeff were curious about the shelf stability of a new hop product. They could have run some chemical tests and gotten a whole bunch of just chemistry data and made decisions with that, or they could have assembled a sensory panel, asked a panel to assess it over time, and made decisions just on that data. But they decided to do both and combine the data to make a more informed decision and understand their product better. So today, Jordan, we're going to talk about using data in brewing, and we've got to talk some statistics too, which I know for me and you is going to be fun. Maybe for some people out there, it's going to make their eyes roll a little bit, but I promise we're just going to try to make it short and simple and talk about some easy things that you can apply in your brewery. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brewlosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons, and as a reward for your support, you get awesome rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is super easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time, but if you're out there listening to this show and all of the other amazing content that Brewlosophy is putting out, please consider showing us your support by becoming a patron. It's because of our patrons that we're able to continue producing new content like the Brewlosophy Show, which if you're not watching on YouTube, I hope you start watching. I'm certainly watching every episode. And you can find more information on how to become a patron at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. You can also support us by using the links at brewlosophy.com/support. So start your shopping experience by using the links and we get a small kickback. Every little bit helps us and it doesn't change your shopping experience. All you have to do is start your shopping by clicking those links at brewlosophy.com/support. Feedback is brought to you by the imaginative crew at Haas, who've developed a revolutionary way to dry hop using Spectrum, a flowable 100% hop-derived product that's fully dispersible in cold side applications for great flavor, efficiency, and less beer loss. No solids means less loss, and it's fully dispersible in cold beer, so there's no contact or residency time required like traditional dry hopping. Spectrum fully disperses immediately, so you don't need to wait 24 to 48 hours or worry about double dry hopping, and you don't have to have any special dry hopping equipment. It stores easily, it's easy to use, saving you precious time and getting instant aroma in each batch. It's currently available to commercial brewers in trial quantities of Citra and Mosaic, so check it out by visiting johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, HAAS.com. All right, we have feedback from Sam already about last week's episode with Julia and Jeff. This is fresh. He says, "Hi, Cade, your latest Brew Lab episode got me thinking about a blog from Scott Janish about hop survivables." And he links the blog, which I can send you if you need that. And he says, and the survivables document released by Yakima Chief for the last few years. So this is also a survivable compound poster produced by Yakima Chief. And I can send you the links to that too if you're interested. But Sam says, "These are both great great resources, but judging by the Yakima Chief documents, the survivables from hops change wildly each year, making the information in Scott's blog a bit out of date. The advantage of his blog was it covered hops not released by Yakima Chief. Do you know a source similar to the Yakima Chief document that covers non-Yakima Chief hops? Also, something which is missing from the Yakima Chief document seems to be something that Julie and Jeff were discussing on the last episode. Which chemicals combine to give impressions of certain flavors? So if I wanted grapefruit rather than tangerine, what hop chemicals should I be combining to get these, and therefore what hops? It'd be great if there was a cheat sheet document outlining this somewhere. Thanks for the great shows. Man, I wish I knew of something like this, Jordan. Do you know of anything like this?
Yeah, those are the two sources of information on that I've seen personally. I think maybe the guest from last week's episode would have been a better person than me to ask. But I did not realize that these vary widely from year to year. I guess that makes sense to me. But I recall that I think Centennial was one that was really high in survivables. It makes me wonder, what kind of variation are we talking here? Like, is it next year's that Citra is the one with all the survival? That's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, Scott's book, that is also, I think, a chapter in his book, too. The blog is out there, too, but Scott really was the one that put all that information together. That was actually my source for anywhere I was looking for hop survivables, or I wanted to know like a flavor compound or something. The tricky part is all of these compounds have been analyzed for years. And so there's lots of literature out there probably that talks about these different compounds, but nobody's put it together as far as I can tell, because that would be a monumental task. There's hundreds of compounds in hops, and it's kind of hard to say that like one or two compounds drives grapefruit flavor, right? There might be 10 compounds that make up grapefruit, or 100 that make up grapefruit flavor. So it's really difficult. The work that Yakima Chief did to put together that survivables document was really cool, and I really like that. And also Scott as well, whenever he put together that blog. I'd love to see something outside of the Yakima Chief varieties, wouldn't you, Jordan?
Yeah. And, there's probably certain varieties that they don't carry, and not to mention when we get to maybe European or New Zealand varieties, I don't know. And another thing that makes me think about this flavor combination idea is how much of a moving target it is, because you're going to have field to field or lot to lot variation. You're going to have variation related to picking window. I've heard, mosaic, etc. Growers and brewers talk about the earlier crops taste different than the later hops, and finding that sweet spot depending on where you're wanting to, lean to blueberry or more dank or pine or something like that. And so I think that having some sort of cheat sheet is going to be really challenging given the types of variation that we see in this agricultural product.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point about maturity picking window when you pick the hops. I've done a lot of work on that myself, which hasn't been published yet. So that's going to be maybe an upcoming episode of the Brew Lab. Maybe you'll get to interview me, Jordan. I don't know. We'll see. But until then, yeah, there's a lot of this would be really cool. I'd love to see this. So maybe I will reach out to Jeff and see if they've got any plans to release something. I mean, I know Yakima Chief and John Ihas partner a lot. They're going to share similar varieties. But maybe there's something out there that people can look into. And if you're listening to this and you know of a document that's not listed in those two sources, just let us know and we'll write it in as feedback. So, all right, after this short break, we'll be back talking about using data to make brewing decisions. We'll be right back. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. Are you opening a brewery, or have you already? Did you know More Beer has a pro division? MoreBeerPro.com is your brewery or brewery in planning one-stop shop for all your brewing needs. From complete brew houses and accessories to fermentation and even cooperage, they've got you covered. More Beer also has the largest selection of malt, hops, chemicals, and other brewing products of any vendor at low wholesale prices, all of which can be delivered on the same pallet, saving you and your brewery even more on shipping costs. Visit MoreBeerPro.com today to sign up for an account and talk with one of their knowledgeable brewery consultants. Brewers make a ton of decisions when making beer. Not all of those decisions require a deep dive into statistics or complex measurements or anything like that. But when we're talking about complicated questions like how long can I store these hops before they go bad, it's important to have access to good data to make the best decisions.
And I think that as we dive into what data is, it might be good to kind of define data because, here at Brewlosophy, we want to make sure that any study that we publish that people understand this is just kind of one data point effectively, right? And so me making a beer last week that turned out great, it would be troublesome to jump to conclusions and say that there was a total cause and effect here that, I increased the mash temperature by 1 degree Fahrenheit from the last time. I think this tastes better. Because at that point, it's really just anecdote. And so it's really about, and that's what this last episode was really all about, is having a lot of data. We have a lot more kind of statistical power to actually infer that there's maybe more cause and effect there than some sort of anecdote associated with like a single piece of data from a given point in time.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Thinking of data as an individual assessment, right? Or as like an individual point versus like data as like a set of individual measurements, right? Like that's a really, really good way to think about this. And so like when you do anything, like for example, your example that you just gave, I brew a beer, I changed one thing in it, I taste it, I think it tastes different from the last time that I brewed it. So that must have mattered, right? That's a data point. It's anecdotal and there's not a lot of statistical power to it. It wasn't repeated. It was one time, it was one batch in one place, one person assessing, right? So there's not a lot of statistical power. It's kind of hard to extrapolate that from that because Jordan, you might do the exact same thing at your brewery and brew the exact same beer, change that one thing and think, no, it tastes exactly the same. I didn't have any difference, right? And that could be because of a whole bunch of different issues, but that also could be because that statistic doesn't really, that particular thing doesn't matter. So it's cool, right? Defining that is one data point. But like you said, at Brewlosophy, whenever we're doing our experiments, we're actually serving this to more than 20 tasters, right? And that gives us the statistical power to say that there was a statistically significant difference in the two beers, the way that they're brewed. We're also super meticulous about making sure that we're only choosing one thing. I mean, Jordan, you've been on those emails now for, over a year, I think at this point. So how much we like talk about and go through like, no, this is the wrong, let's pick a different style or, let's talk about this or how are you actually adding that ingredient and what time and all that stuff. And so brewers are also doing this same thing. Brewers are always collecting data. If you're a home brewer, from a home brewer all the way up to a commercial brewer, I know that you're collecting original gravity and ending gravity, right? Everyone's catching that. And if you're not catching that, you really need to be because who knows what your beer's doing and if it's even done. But that's a data point and you can use that to do things over time. So yeah, I kind of wanted to start also, like you said, like defining data as this like set of information that you can use something with. But then also, when do you need data and when can you just make a decision without it, right? Like when do you need to take measurements and when do you have to have like a set of data and look at it and analyze it and then make decisions based on that? What are your thoughts there?
And I think part of it is scale, right? As a home brewer, you might you have a hunch that this can be a cool hop, or there might not be any data available, right? And that would be applicable to both pros and home brewers. So I think that as a home brewer, you have a little bit more luxury here to maybe break some rules or take some risks, but pro brewers don't because jobs and paychecks are on the line. And so I think that it's really important to track everything we can in the brew house. And I'm sure that some of the best technical brewers out there like Sierra Nevada, New Belgium, they are tracking every minuscule thing you could possibly imagine. And collectively, they can actually build these data sets and maybe even run statistics and, find that things like, hey, we found that if we store our yeast 2 degrees colder, we're having better shelf life. Or, who knows? And so it's all about collecting all these things that you possibly could ever collect data on, and then ultimately looking back at them, actually analyzing them, and leaning into that to make your beer better.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good point about scale because I think about like home brewers, right? If you want to add raspberry to a beer, you can just do it, right? I mean, you don't need to test out the beer and make sure and see like what's going to happen when you add the raspberry additions and all that stuff. You can just do it and add raspberry and be okay with it, right? But as a commercial brewer, if you're going to release a beer that's got raspberry in it, you've got to look at everything. You got to look at shelf stability. You got to look at changes in original gravity. You got to look at when the beer's finished. You got to look at, fining and haze and all this other stuff that might make your product unshelf stable. So, it's kind of cool too that as a home brewer, you can just kind of do what you want, right? Without having to collect a whole bunch of data. But there are times when you should collect data, like when you're trying to figure out what's wrong with my efficiency, or why did my beer not get down to terminal gravity? It was supposed to get down to like 1010, but it stopped at 1030. What happened? And like all these sorts of questions. If you've got a data set, if you've been collecting your information, you can make reasonable decisions about how to move forward. So this is kind of a good point too. What's the difference between good data and bad data? I mean, you've got to have this in your like daily career, right? This has got to be one of the big challenges for you, is like, what is good information from consumers and then what's bad information?
So in the social science world, we really tend to think about this from a kind of two-pronged perspective: reliability and validity. So when it comes to reliability, we want to make sure that respondents are answering in a reliably consistent pattern. So an example of that would be that when we ask them, what is your gender, they reliably answer male or female. And so they understand what this measurement is based on the question, and they're able to kind of like cluster in similar answer sets, regardless of whether they're accurate or not, right? And so that's when we come into something like validity. So even if the respondents are reliably saying male or female, but if they're always answering the opposite gender or, a third gender, et cetera, that they don't actually personally hold, that means that we're not getting valid data. So a reliable example would be if some are saying animals, some are saying colors, some are saying genders. We're not reliably getting the same type of data. So if we asked people their gender and they all were saying, different species of cats, you can see that we're it's very reliable, but it's not valid. We're getting different types of data than we were intending to get. So when it comes to the brew house, that's the key here. When it comes to data, is that we need to make sure that we're getting reliable and valid data. And so a lot of that's going to come to measurement. And that's really what they talked about in this prior episode, is collecting both sensory data and also chemistry data. And that is one way that we can kind of expand the total cohesiveness of the data that we're collecting in the brew house to really try to get more reliable and more valid data, because only one source might not be 100% in either direction.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. Reliable and valid. I mean, I could think about like your OG, right? To go back to that basic, statistic, right? Your starting gravity. If you're measuring it with a hydrometer and your hydrometer's messed up, or you're measuring, here's a great thing. You're measuring it because it's hot out of your brew house and you didn't want to cool it down all the way to 68 or 70. So you measured it at 85 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Like 30 degrees Celsius instead of 20 degrees Celsius, and your hydrometer is not calibrated to that point. So you're going to be off no matter what. Right. So you're reliable because if you measure it at, let's say, at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that's really reliable, right? Like it's because you're always doing it the same way. It's super reliable, but it's not accurate because your hydrometer is set for 68 degrees Fahrenheit or around 20 Celsius. So that's a very good example, like in the brew house, of reliability versus validity, good data versus bad data. So if you're, like, man, I can't hit my efficiencies. This sucks. I don't understand why I'm never getting where I want on my OG. If you're measuring your hydrometer at the wrong temperature, it might be that easy. I mean, gosh, I wish problems were all that easy, don't you, Jordan?
Right, but I think that's a good point, is how you can be reliably inaccurate. And so it's all about balancing the two. And I really like this idea of not stopping with a single data stream, right? And I think, like I said earlier, the best breweries in the world, they're really making sure that they're collecting data at all points of the process. And then ultimately, a good analyst is bringing them all together.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, this is where you get into the trouble too. Like Jeff is always talking about with sensory, right? It is this whole concept of reliability versus validity, and then, bringing everything together so that you've got a usable data set, because people are very, very finely tuned instruments, right? We're very good at detecting odors and tasting, and we're also pretty good at describing what what we're tasting. Some better than others. I mean, some people have quote finer palates. Maybe they're better capable of describing something, maybe not necessarily better at detecting something. That's been kind of debunked over the years, but that's a side note. But you've got sort of this, it's a reliability and a validity problem whenever you're talking about using humans as instruments, right? Because depending on what you ate for lunch that day might change the way that you perceive something at the later that day in sensory testing, right? And this is where chemistry data can come in and be like, well, okay, this is actually an instrument. We can finally dial in this instrument to repeat this test over and over and over, and we can be confident that the data is reliable and accurate. But then the question is, what does it mean? Like, who cares if there's linalool in here? I don't know what linalool adds to the beer. Well, I do know what linalool adds to the beer, but for most people don't, right? Like, I don't know what that flavor adds. And just linalool isn't the only source of great or a fruity, hoppy flavor, right? That's not the only compound that's in there doing it. So I could measure linalool until the end of the time, but maybe not understand how hop flavor changes or how hops are different based on just that one compound. So it's a really big challenge, for ingredient suppliers.
Yeah, and I think that the sensory versus chemistry is a really good example of how natural variation is all around us, and it really makes reliability and validity tricky. For example, we know that humans have different perception thresholds as it relates to diacetyl. Some people are more sensitive. Some people can't taste it no matter how much you spike their, the flavor kit into their drink. And so it just goes to show that humans are not consistently, reliably able to detect diacetyl, DMS, etc., due to the natural variation that exists within our palates. So we can actually measure these things, though, under a microscope or some sort of chemistry trial or something like that, depending on the compound that we're looking at here. And so that can be a lot more of a reliable indicator of what it is that we're looking for. But there are just certain things that you can't see in a microscope, like grapefruit flavor, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's where we need to be willing to live with the natural variation that exists within the human palate and have large enough sample sizes to smooth over the noise and actually start to hone things in.
That was one of the really central things that we talked about with Jeff and Julia, right? And this kind of this question is like technical, hard scientific data better than squishy, subjective sensory data, right? And like the answer to that is, I don't know, probably it depends, right, on what you're looking for. If I'm interested in what's the concentration of diacetyl in my beer, then yeah, technical, hard scientific data probably answers that question better than like, here, smell this and see if it's got diacetyl in it, right? I mean, that can give you that information. But to your point about diacetyl, here, smell this. Is somebody might be super sensitive, and then you're rejecting all of these batches of beer because you've got one person that's really sensitive to diacetyl. Or on the flip side, here, smell this. Somebody smells it and doesn't smell anything because they're agnostic or they're anemic. I can't remember the word. Whatever, they can't smell diacetyl, right? And then you're passing all these beers through QA, and all these butter bombs are going through. So it depends on your question that you're trying to ask. And so that's kind of the central issue, right? Is this push and pull between like, I want to be technical and I want to be scientific, but I also want usable, practical data, right? Because again, we can measure all kinds of compounds and identify them and break them apart and run them through electron microscopy and all this sort of stuff, to figure out exactly what this compound is. But when it all comes together, the gestalt of it is still the question, right? And collecting data can be hard. It can take a lot of time. I mean, putting together a sensory panel is no joke, right? I mean, even in brewlosophy experiments, collecting 20 tasters to come and do a triangle test and actually give you a result is challenging. It's hard to find 20 people that want to do this and they're willing to, go through through the tasting panel and write down what they tasted and all that. So collecting data is hard. And like, there's a question also then is like, why would you want to collect data? So what do you think? What are your opinions on that, Jordan? Why collect data in the brew house at all?
Well, it kind of reminds me of that, catchphrase, anything worth doing is worth doing well, right? Because a single point of data is simply an anecdote. And so you kind of have to go all in. You can't just ask two people and think that you have what you need. And so a key component here is a representative sample. And it's difficult to achieve a representative sample without a large sample. And so we're not able to make informed decisions based on anecdote alone. It's better than nothing. But by actually going in and getting all the data you possibly can, you start to actually be able to tell a story statistically that has some meat to it, that actually could stand up to some level of scientific rigor. And so that's the challenge when it comes to data quality, right? Is it's not simply, do we have a reliable measurement? Do we have a valid measurement? But do we have enough of those measurements to be confident that the data that we're looking at is representative enough to infer some sort of conclusion, because otherwise it's just garbage in and garbage out.
Oh man, you just totally summed up this really cool article from Craft Beer and Brewing. It's called Brewing Analytics, and I have a link to it if anybody's interested in it. But they essentially distill it down into three things. It says collect data, transform the data, and then use it to predict, right? And so that's pretty much exactly what you just said. You need to collect data such that you have enough data out there, transform it into something usable like a graph or statistics or something like that, so that you can actually look at the data, and then you can use that data to predict an outcome, right? Here's what will happen if I do this in the future. Here's what will happen if I mash at 150 versus mashing at 145. This is how my OG changes, right? And this is also how the beer sensory changes, so you've got this, collect it, transform it into something usable, and then predict what you're going to do. And this scales from the smallest of breweries to the largest of breweries, right? I mean, like you said earlier, Sierra Nevada, New Belgium, and of course, like Miller Coors, Anheuser-Busch, Heineken, all these international companies, clearly they're collecting piles of data. There's a question I might ask one of them one time. I wonder how much data they actually collect that gets used. Like how much are they just like collecting all these temperatures and things, and then it just goes into some like data base, a database, and just sits there and never does anything with it, because it's just like, well, we've got this data, but we don't really do anything with it. There's that kind of an issue too, right? Is collecting too much data. Well, I mean, not necessarily too much data as long as it's in a usable format. And so that's something I think that we as homebrewers probably have a bazillion, Brewfather or Beersmith recipes on the computer or on the cloud. But if we actually wanted to start analyzing what predicts FG, be it, malt brand or OG, yada, 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 we'd have to transcribe every single data point into a data set that we could actually use statistical software to actually analyze. And so I think that's the key here, is if you had a kind of semi-automated way to convert the practical data points that you have into analyzable data streams. So what if Beersmith, we could automatically download a data set that had each row was a beer, and then every column was a variable that we had data on for the brew. We would have a really powerful data set at that point, but it all comes down to transcription and usability, right? So as long as you have a true data set that's even a semi-automated data stream, there's really no such thing as too much data. Then we get into the analytical decisions of how do we deal with that much data. Right. How do you deal with it? I guess that's the tough part, right? How do you deal with this much data? Dude, that would be so cool if Brewfather or Beersmith, if you could do that, or if it was even built into the, to the software, right? To the app. If you could just say like, hey, what's my OGs over time? And then it just, over the last 50 brews, where's my OG at? Or like, what's my OG for IPAs? What, that I've been brewing over the last 50 times. And then it'll just like say, here it is. And it spits out like a graph or something. That'd be super cool and super usable. And if you could spit out something like that into even an Excel sheet that would be usable to do, that'd be really cool. But that is a good point, right? And so Craft Beer and Brewing in that Brewing Analytics article would call that transformation, right? Transforming the data from, I have a whole list of OGs, but then I don't have them in an Excel sheet or a statistical software or anything that I can put someplace. Or worse, like you said, right? I've got my brew sheet, and my brew sheet has, here's the amount of grains I'm adding. Here's the hop schedule. Here's, the OG. Here's the FG. Here's my pH adjustment. Here's my water chemistry. This is what time it started fermenting. This is the temperature, right? All that stuff that you collect. All those things are great, but it's just on a handwritten brew sheet. Unless somebody puts it into an app or into an Excel sheet or something, there's nothing that you can do with it. It's great. You collected that data. It's just in a binder somewhere and nobody's doing anything with it. You can look back at it if you want to make another recipe decision, but you're not able to tweak like efficiencies or figure out your hop selection or, those kinds of things. And, you have to remember that you brewed, I guess, what you brewed in order to do it. So it is cool, right? You collect the data and then transform it into something usable. So there's a lot of different data streams that, especially like home brewers, but even, commercial brewers are already looking at this stuff. And then it's, like OG, pH, water chemistry, malt, ingredient lists, hop alpha and beta, sensory data, for all this stuff is all being collected. But how do you transform it? I mean, Jordan, have you ever taken any of your data like that you've been brewing with and done any statistics on it? I'm just curious.
I've dreamed about it. And
right?
That's one thought I had if I was ever to open a brewery, to actually really lean into that, because there's got to be so much statistical wizardry that we could do to craft better beer that we're just smaller craft breweries simply aren't doing. So I'm basically just building upon anecdote after anecdote. I've never actually ran any hard numbers and, performed a regression analysis on my brews or anything like that. It's really just been kind of following the hunches that kind of, continue to tell the same story.
Yeah, right. I mean, what I would say, if I'm articulating that a little bit differently, I would say you're using your instrument, you're using your nose to make changes and make decisions, right? Like you're using, I liked this beer with this hop in it, and so this is the way I brew. Or for example, right, like your lagers, right? Right, you like to traditionally lager your lagers, right? You don't like to quick lager. You like to let them go low and slow over time because you found that over time, over brewing a number of lager beers, that you like that flavor and that outcome, right? That's totally using data to drive a decision. Every time you taste one of your lager beers, you're using that information to drive your next batch, right?
Right. And I think that this is a key differentiator between true statistical analyses and kind of just like learning your lessons based on your own history. And I think that's the latter is really what a lot of craft brewers are doing. Is they're, it worked on the last batch, it worked on the last 50 batches, so we're going to continue to do that. And they develop these, SOPs based on kind of simple heuristics of paying attention. But when we actually start to make data sets and actually start to run statistics, who knows what you could find out? And it could be right under your nose that who would have thought that the Brees brand is attenuating better? You might not see that without actually running the numbers.
Oh, yeah. Or maybe Brees doesn't have as much haze as some of the smaller craft brewers, which we've talked about, your craft maltsters, which we've talked about a couple of times on the show, as just totally, again, that's totally a Cade thing. My suspicion is that some of these, some of craft maltsters are contributing to higher haze. But in any event, I don't have any data to support that. I need to do a study on it. So okay, that's all right. So I want to talk about transforming data, which I want to do that after the break. But before we get there, we got to figure out what data should you be collecting, or what are options for data that you should be collecting. So I kind of ran through a list there, but I want to kind of break this down like Jeff and Julia did into like chemistry data and sensory data, right? So obviously most brewers aren't going to be able to run their beer through a GC like Julia did, right? I think mostly ingredient suppliers like maltsters and hop companies are going to be able to do that, and maybe advanced breweries like New Belgium. Hey, stay Casey and Justin, and Sierra Nevada. They might be able to actually run their beers through those and break those down into chemicals. But remember, chemistry data is also just an OG measurement. That's chemistry data. And if you're able to calculate the malt that you put in the beer, look at your temperature that you mash, and then measure your OG, you should be able to have some sort of prediction efficiency or prediction of what I should get out of this malt whenever it goes into the kettle. That's chemistry data. And if you look at that over time, you might be able to, like you said, Jordan, say, okay, hey, I like what I get from Brees in terms of efficiency, right? And same thing with pH and water chemistry, how you're changing your water. Like, that one's a big one for homebrewers. And for me, especially, like if you're using tap water and your tap water is changing, you're making a different beer, right? And if you're not tracking like where your water's coming from, or if you're using RO, you're actually writing down your water chemistry. But then what are the sensory aspects of that? I have all these sort of questions and data. And then for big brewers, I mean, the sky's the limit, right? I mean, anything. You can go OG at the time at knockout, OG at the end of the kettle, OG after the whirlpool. What's my trub? What's my, haze? What's my color? What temperature am I getting down to? How long am I whirlpooling? What's my flow rate? What's my evaporation rate? I mean, all these things. There's a billion data points that you can get. That's just in the brew house. That's not even getting into the cellar side of things. But there's a billion pieces of data, in terms of like chemistry. I mean, I don't know. You have any other thoughts on sort of those things and what you can collect?
It really is never ending. I think we'd need a few more podcasts to get through them all.
Well, yeah, sure. Especially if we wanted to break them all down. And hey, maybe that's why we have this show, because people do break down those individual things. And then of course, don't forget sensory data, right? Jeff would be shaking his fist at me if I didn't talk about sensory too. I'm honestly surprised at how many homebrewers don't record their sensory data, which I think is interesting, right? Every time you drink your home beer, what's the first thing that you do? You go, this is what I like, or this is what I don't like. Write it down. Just store it and save it. I guarantee you will love that, having that information. Going back the next time that you brew that beer, at the bottom of the sheet, it now says, oh, hey, this tasted like vanilla and apricots. Oh, that's awesome. I'd like to brew that again. Let me try that, right? Or, oh yeah, what was really special about this beer? What did I like? Just write it down. I mean, bigger breweries obviously are running through sensory panels, so they've got sensory panels and statistics and all this information. The comment boxes are fun on descriptive analysis panels, where it's just like, this smells like an old shoe, or the things people come up with, all kinds of crazy. It smells like a sunset on a moonlit beach. Okay, I don't know what that smells like, but awesome. But in any event, when you have these sensory data, write it down, because it's important and you can use it. It can help you drive decisions. I think that maybe that's a key thing too, right? Like, what did Adam Savage say from Mythbusters? I think he said, like, the difference between science and screwing around is writing it down. But in any event, so lots of different things. Write it down, collect all your data, but then you have to transform it. So what to do with it? We'll answer that question right whenever we come back from this break. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. American author Mark Twain popularized the phrase, "There are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics." It's certainly true that many people's eyes glaze over when talking about statistics, and they can be complicated, but our goal here is to apply the science, make it practical and usable, and that requires a little bit of analysis of the data that you've worked so hard to collect, so you can make better brewing decisions. Jordan, where should we start when we're talking about transforming the data that we've collected? Is it as simple as just an Excel spreadsheet, or some sort of addition to Beersmith or Brewfather?
Right, and for me, I would really define that as collecting data. And so, like I was saying earlier, make your life easier by collecting it in a usable format to begin with. And so obviously data automation is amazing power, and it would be great if the brewing softwares that homebrewers use have that capability, and maybe it even does, and we just don't know about it. I would not be surprised if ProMash or whatever, the pros are using at this point do have data stream options, but it's really critical to get that data in a usable format as quickly as possible. And we run into issues like transcription error, et cetera. And that's then becomes, an issue of reliability and validity, right? When you're getting that data into a usable format. So I think that when I think of transform, I'm thinking of data reduction or data transformation techniques such as factor analysis, principal components analysis, indices, and things like that. So for me, when I think of transform, I'm thinking of making a lot of data a little smaller to make it a little bit more usable.
That's a really great way of saying that. I'm going to try to remember that for my PhD defense. This is the whole point of statistics, is to make a lot of data a little bit smaller and easier to understand.
Right. Well, yeah. It gets complex pretty quickly, right? But I think that the average person uses a lot more statistics than they think they do, and probably has a better understanding than they give themselves credit for. So when we think of statistics, one thing you learn in like an intro-level class is that there's univariate, bivariate, and multivariate. And when listening to the episodes with you reviewing the Brewing Scientist, they throw these terminologies around pretty casually, and maybe that would be a good place to start for the kind of lay listener that may not understand what a multivariate analysis is. So a univariate analysis is a single dimension, like the proportion of people that voted for a certain candidate in the last presidential election. So that is just 60% voted for candidate A. That's a univariate statistic. So what if we wanted to know how men and women voted for candidate A? Now we're crossing one domain, proportion voting for a candidate, by another domain, gender. And so now we have a bivariate analysis where we're actually looking at the proportion that voted per gender identity. So that's still pretty simple, right? And we can use statistical tests to determine whether there is a statistically significant difference in that voting behavior. So a really common one for this type of categorical data, where it's not numeric like age or something like that, but it's kind of this like binary or categorical issue, something like gender, where you could be male, female, or other. We're running something like a chi-square or a z-test. So we're comparing the proportions. And it gets back to what we said earlier. It's that sample size issue. If we surveyed two people and asked them, and they were different genders, and asked them who they voted for, we wouldn't have enough of a sample size and thus statistical confidence for the test to determine whether that difference is real, right? And so that's where sample size comes in. So those are really, really simple. And univariate and bivariate statistics we're all doing pretty much in our daily lives. The proportion of people that want pizza versus tacos or something like that at the party. These are basic things that we're doing all the time. So something like an average, that's a measurement of central tendency. So the average time that it takes you to ferment the beer to terminal. When we start to look at how that varies by ale versus lager in the brew house, now we have an example of a bivariate analysis. But that's not really what your guests are talking about. They're going way more advanced into the multivariate realm. And that's when we have at least 3 variables, basically, that are involved. And we start to get into more advanced statistical techniques as well. So a simple average is just way more simple than something advanced like regression analysis. And so when we get into the multivariate world, there's really 2 main things that I could think of that we are doing in that. One is the data reduction world. And so your guest in the last episode talked about factor analysis, and that's a common technique for data reduction. And so what we do in a factor analysis is try to find latent patterns that co-vary within the data that we didn't necessarily observe on our own. And they can find clusters of things that act similar together, right? And so ultimately, we might have had 100 data points, but it reveals 4 factors. And let's say, for the sake of argument, it actually effectively utilized all 100 data points, where we've concentrated 100 domains into 4, right? And so that's a great example of data transformation. We've transformed 100 domains into 4 factors. So that's one thing we can do in a multivariate analysis is data reduction techniques. But another thing we can do is predictive analysis. We can actually see how variables X, Y, and Z might collectively predict the outcomes of the dependent variable. For example, in the brewery setting, maybe we want to see how OG, malt variety, and pH predict FG. And so it's by looking at multiple variables beyond a simple, 2 + 2 = 4, we can start to get really powerful predictive analytics in the multivariate world.
Yeah, and so like a couple of the examples then that they were talking about, right? That Jeff and Julia were talking about was like the reduction, the data reduction techniques, the factors. That's where if you're looking at like a plot and there's 4 quadrants, I mean, there's really just 2 factors, right? Usually in those plots that you're looking at, but you can look at how the relationship between those 2 factors are. Things that are close to each other actually, smell like or are related in some way, right? So, for example, in their shelf stability test, right, they were able to plot the chemistry data. All the chemistry data points are individual, not factors, but they're individual sets of data, right, that you can review. And then they're able to combine that with all of the sensory attributes that they did. So, for their descriptive analysis, sensory attributes. And when you try to reduce all of that information down into factors, they're able to put a couple of factors together and then show visually that, okay, yeah, whenever it has this flavor, for example, it's close to this chemistry component or these sets of chemistry components. So maybe these chemistry components are markers for when we get to shelf-stable things like cardboard or caramel, right? Maybe these markers are things we can look at, and we can watch this marker as it changes over time to then understand, okay, this is when we can tell that once the concentration of this marker gets so high, now we can tell that the product is no longer shelf stable, right? That's the whole end goal. We're not there yet, right? And I think Julia was very clear about that. That would be fantastic if we're able to do that. And that's what they're trying to do, is kind of distill that data all the way down there, right? So that's the reduction. The reduction is putting it into the factor analysis to understand the relationships between these data points. And then the predictive capacity is to say, okay, now that I understand this relationship, can I use this chemical compound to predict this sensory outcome and know when I have my shelf stability? I think that's a good way of sort of like distilling all that down, right? Into what Jeff and Julia were trying to do.
Right. And with factor analysis, it's not going to give you the same type of coefficients that we're going to expect in a regression, where in a regression example, I think that the one that they referenced was partial least squares, is we could say, assuming the statistical test confirmed that this was a statistically significant finding, but like for every X increase in variable A, we expect a, Y increase or decrease in variable B. And so that's where predictive analytics could be hugely helpful in the brew house, especially a professional brewery, is you could start to really hone in things like pitch rate, temperature, et cetera, with known outcomes. And that's really the power of predictive analytics. But you got to have really large sample sizes to actually pull this stuff off.
Yeah, really large sample sizes and high confidence in your data too, right? Like high confidence that what you're collecting is actually repeatable. So I would think of like sensory, for example, right? And you mentioned like variation between ingredients, right? I might have brewed a beer with Citra using the exact same amount of Citra, but that Citra came from a different lot, right? And so because it came from a different lot, that Citra might have a different or aromatic profile, right? So if I'm trying to understand how Citra components impact sensory flavor, right? The Citra itself, like the hop itself, once you've brewed a beer with it, that hop is done, right? You can't reuse it. You can't take that hop out, put it into another beer and redo it over and over and over again. So this is where you get into like some of these really difficult challenges with collecting and transforming data and then making rational decisions. It would make everybody's life super easy if you could just consistently repeat, right, over and over and over again the exact same things. But that's the trouble with beer. Once beer is made and drunk, it's gone. The sample has disappeared. And so this whole transformation of data using multifactorial statistics or using even just simple stats like averages, the goal is to make a decision, right? The goal is to understand and be able to move forward. And there's a whole lot of statistical things out there. And a good point, like catching me on prediction, because I need to be careful. In the statistics world, prediction is very different than like a common parlance of what I would call prediction, right? To me, a prediction is, like I said earlier, like you understand the relationship between something, and then you can guess that by increasing or monitoring this compound, this relationship is going to happen. But prediction in the statistical world is like you said, Jordan, it's like partial least squares or, regression analysis or something like that. And that actually gives you like an equation, right? Like you can multiply the concentration of, or multiply the OG by some coefficient, and that might actually be able to predict what your FG is going to be, right? Or take OG by a coefficient plus, malt color by a coefficient, and that predicts what the flavor is going to come out as. Something like that. Like it actually gives you an equation that you can use to predict outcomes, which can be hugely beneficial in breweries. I mean, like especially some of the larger breweries like Miller Coors and AB and Sierra Nevada and New Belgium that are using, wort streams to try to homogenize and make sure things are actually the same. They can use these sort of statistics to make real decisions in real time. So there's a lot out there. But for the simple home brewer, what are some things that a simple home brewer can do to transform the data that they've collected into usable information? I might suggest some Excel sheets, but what do you think, Jordan?
Yeah, I would say if you want to do this right, beyond simply just learning from your prior lessons, kind of like I do, is I would have a Excel spreadsheet, and every brew day you collect the same things. I think the obvious ones are like OG, FG, pH at mash, maybe pH at terminal. You obviously the sky's the limit here, and then I think that we want to go to sensory as well. Maybe you have variables like I'm getting a grapefruit flavor with a check mark or things like that, or high body, et cetera, et cetera. By keeping it in a usable data set to begin with, you're already ahead of the game, and you can actually start to look at these things. But, you're going to need 50 brews or so under your belt before you're going to have any statistical power to actually analyze this stuff at a true statistical level. And really, I would want to go up to 200 or so before I'm having a whole lot of confidence in advanced statistics.
Well, sure, exactly. And so that's kind of my point too, right? Like a home brewer to brew 200 batches, that's going to take a hell of a long time, for a home brewer to get 200 batches. I might not actually be at 200 batches myself. Maybe. I bet I'm somewhere close to that, but probably haven't made 200 batches of beer myself. A commercial brewer is going to make 200 batches of beer a year, and I mean, it's just going to go quick. So they're going to be able to do that stuff. But there's even more like simple things that you can do so that you don't have to take like full statistical analysis to be able to see changes over time, for example. So like if you've got your brews, and let's say you brew 10 brews a year, right? And you want to see how your OG is changing, or let me go back to a style, right? Like you're making a Kolsch, for example, one beer that I've brewed a bunch of times and that I had to like dial in. I could have used, data to help me understand how my Kolsch is changing. And one way, an easy way to do that is deciding like, I always say my Kolsch recipe is 95% either Pils or two-row, right? Pils and two-row, those are different malts, and those are probably going to give me different OGs and different extract efficiencies and maybe even change the flavor of the beer. But what I've learned anecdotally is that I don't care about those differences, if it's Pils or Pale Ale. Those are close enough that the Kolsch is going to be great, right? But if I want the Kolsch to be the same, right, and every time, and people be able to brew this 100% of the time, then I need to know what the difference is. Do I like the ones that are Pils, or do I like the ones that are pale malt? And the way to do that is write that down in a spreadsheet and like this one, yes or no, or like the malt flavor, yes. Don't like the malt flavor, no. And then you can just put an Excel, graph and say like, okay, here are the 10 brews, and these are the ones that I liked or didn't like, right? Yes, liked, didn't like, yes, liked, didn't like. And then you can sort of dive deeper in, well, what was my extract efficiency of these 10 brews? Plot that on a graph, and then plot those two things on the graph. And then you can see like, okay, my extract, my OG was higher on the ones that I liked. It had nothing to do with Pilsner or, pale malt. It was just that the OG was higher on the ones that I liked. So maybe I liked a little bit higher alcohol in the beer. Those kinds of decisions. And that's just trends over time using some Excel graphs to do stuff. That's an easy way to do and make some decisions.
Yeah, I think that some data is better than no data, right? And statisticians are always quick to caution that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. The one that you learn in school is there's a correlation between the murder rate and ice cream sales. And the lesson there is that clearly the more ice cream that is sold in the grocery stores is not fueling murderous crime sprees. In fact, we have a confounding variable that we haven't accounted for in this example, which is heat. And that as it gets hotter, ice cream sales go up. We also see, more crime. And so as a brewer, there's no reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you're observing a correlation, pay attention to that. We might not have enough data to run truly predictive analytics, which can give us a formula that'll give us the exact amount for lever A to drive outcome B. But if you're observing a correlation consistently, there's probably something going on there. And, we don't necessarily have to rigorously establish causality to learn from the data that we're collecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I mean, I have a very good, very practical example that I think a lot of homebrewers talk about too, is their efficiency, right? Like how much their malt efficiency is. Anytime somebody says that they're having problems with efficiency, they're not hitting their numbers or they're overhitting their numbers or whatever, they're having a problem with efficiency. My first reaction is to tell them, look at their mill gap, because that's been my experience that changing the mill gap changes my efficiency the most. That's having the most effect. Like, yes, malt quality can have an issue, water that I add in different places, all those things can have an issue, but I've controlled for most of those. So mill gap is the thing. If you write down and measure your mill gap, you can measure it, or you can just run like the thickness of a credit card is kind of what I do. Put the credit card down in there and then close it up so that it's about that thick. And then write down when my mill gap is the thickness of the credit card, my efficiency is on the number or not, right? Here's my OG. When I expand it just wider than the gap of a credit card, then it's this. Or if you're able to measure it, right? When my mill gap is 5/64 or whatever, this is what my efficiency is. When it's 6/64, this is what it is. When it's 7/64, this is what it is. You write that down, and then this is what my OG is. You can actually see, okay, I like my mill gap being set at 7/64, and that will help you hit your numbers and your efficiency. It'll also show you if your mill gap is changing over time, which has happened to me, right? I set the mill gap, and then I run malt through it, and then don't check the mill gap the next time, run some malt through it, and don't hit my efficiency. Well, it turns out that my mill gap was actually moving while I was running malt through it. And so I needed to tighten a couple of bolts on the mill, and then boom, my efficiencies are fixed, right? Because I wasn't measuring or checking the mill gap. Now, that doesn't mean you have to check the mill gap every single time. I mean, come on, there's time and effort that takes all this stuff. But if you're having issues, the easiest way to fix a problem is by having data to look at to see what the problem could have been, is my point.
Right. And so what you're demonstrating here is a bivariate analysis, right? The relationship between mill gap and extract efficiency. But there could be a third or fourth or fifth confounding variable. And that's why when we're doing things like this, the extent that we can isolate the variable is key, because it could be, in fact, that it's a function of malt brand or grist variety, right? You're using a lot of caramel malt in the second batch, and the third batch is all Pilsner malt. You're going to have different efficiencies based on all these variables. So the extent to which we can really dial in and isolate a single variable, when we're looking at simple correlations, you're going to have a lot more confidence in that result. When you start to modulate other things along the way, like we always do as home brewers or even as pro brewers, that's where predictive analysis is really helpful, because you're actually able to net out or like cancel out the noise or the the variation that exists within the system that you're interested in, and see if there truly is a cause and effect with, in this example, mill gap.
Yeah, you're able to account for that variation, right? You're able to put a number on it and account for that variation. That's a huge deal in statistics, is figuring out sources of variation. That's where those factors come into play when you're talking about multi-factor analysis. It accounts for the highest percentage of a variation in the data. And if you can get 100%, then fantastic. You've done a great job. But I don't know that that's ever happened in any actual data that I've ever analyzed, like real data, not like fake data. Meaning like for stats class or something. But anyway, there was another thing that I wanted to ask too about, Jordan, that I think you are a little bit meticulous about, and that's about your blends for sours. Do you ever I know whenever you make your sours, you take and blend things and test it out in small vials before you actually, or small glasses before you actually blend your sours. Have you ever written down your sour blend and looked at how that changes, or if you're how things are or aren't in your sours?
Yeah, it's funny. I do write things down. I have a little sour notebook. Part of it is because, you're like, okay, 4 to this one, 2 parts of this one, a half part of that one, 0.75 points of that one. You can't remember all this stuff on blending day without writing it down, right? So if anything, it's writing a recipe that I'm going to follow immediately afterwards. But I have this as a reference in case I wanted to ever go back and look. But, I'm not drawing from 100-barrel tanks and only drawing some of it. It's like, on blending day, I'm kind of using everything I've got, and then the process starts are over. So I do have all of these logs, but they're not really that helpful, 2 years later when the bottles have been drank and I have new sour stocks I'm sitting on.
Right, when you've got new sour stocks. But one of the things I'm kind of curious about is your culture, right? Because if I understand, you're still repitching the same culture, right? You're not harvesting, or you're not pitching a fresh lab culture each time when you make a sour beer, right?
No, I'm not pitching a fresh one, and I was better at having more variation in my sour stock, where this would be the, bootleg Minneapolis blend one, and this one would be the yeast bay amalgamation one, and I'm definitely getting a bit of cultural drift where I'm kind of just rolling with the house culture at this point. So it's been a bit in flux for me, where now I kind of am in that world where I'm using the same culture, but it used to be I'd have tons of variation within that sour stock.
But that's kind of an interesting thing to me too, is have you, as now that you're sort of using this house culture, is your culture changing, right? Is it are you starting to, is it getting more sour, for example? Are you starting to blend more of your fresh beer in? I'm just totally throwing out a number, but let's say that you were 75% sour and 25% fresh beer, that's totally an oversimplification. But, and then a couple of years later now of repitching this, now you're 85% sour and, 15% fresh beer, or the opposite. You're 60% sour and 40% fresh beer. That'd be kind of interesting to know, how your culture is changing over time. Is it getting more sour, less sour, and what's going on with your brew house? This would be kind of fun information to know, right?
Yeah, well, this is a really fun kind of idea to ponder on as we close out here, because I think it exposes the difficulty in my trying to develop some sort of reasonable confidence in causality here, because there's all these variables that are constantly changing. Hop variety, grist, brewing system, etc. And so, yes, anecdotally, I am seeing that this culture is making very sour beer, and it would be interesting actually to compare the pH of the sour stock of the one that I made before the one I'm currently sitting on, which is at 2.9 pH or something like that. But I'm not confident, given my sample size and the other confounding variables that are going on, that it's simply the culture. Maybe I used 10 IBUs last time and I only used 5 this time, right? And so that's the power of statistics, is as we can start to control for the variation in the things that we don't care about and ultimately reveal what we do care about.
Yeah, yeah. And if you are a larger brewer out there that's brewing a bunch of sour beers, I mean, like, well, for example, I was talking with Daniel LePage at Creature Comforts about Athena, right? They're using statistics whenever they were tracking down all of those issues with their kettle sour production, right? Using statistics to try to figure out what's going on and why is this beer changing, this time in these areas. So you've got all this power that you can do, and it's a great thing. If you can collect the data, transform it or transcribe it into something that's simplifies it, then you can use it to predict or at least to make decisions that can influence your brewing. So well, this was pretty cool, and thank you to Jeff and Julia for doing a cool experiment looking at shelf stability and also bringing this topic up, because I feel like this is something that a lot of brewers just go like, yeah, I'm just going to brew the beer, I don't have time to collect the data. But you have time to collect the data and look back, set some time to look back at the data and help you make decisions. Anything else you wanted to add about collecting data to make better decisions, Jordan?
I would say pro brewers is to set up data streams so that you're automatically collecting this stuff. And if you don't have anyone in-house that has a rudimentary understanding of statistics, maybe reach out to a local university. I'm sure a budding grad student or someone would be interested to help you out, maybe as part of their master's thesis or something like that. And then I would say that home brewers, you certainly could nerd out and go super deep and collect every data point you possibly could imagine. But at the very least, pay attention to your correlations. What trends are you observing? Learn from your prior mistakes and, make better beer going forward. There's no reason a home brewer can't have some simple level of statistics in their brew house as well.
Yeah, I love both of those, and I think we should leave those right there. So that sounds good to me. Well, Jordan, thank you for joining me in the lab, and we will be back again in 2 weeks with our next Applying the Science episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.